Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson describes the current condition of U.S. winter wheat. Kate Brooks analyzes retail beef prices and demand. Aaron Berger discusses pasture conditions. And Al Dutcher recaps a cool, wet week and looks ahead at the next 7 days. North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our marketing analyst this week. Many crop-growing areas of Nebraska stood still this week, drying out after earlier precipitation. As of the latest USDA crop progress report, Nebraska had completed 1/5 of its corn planting and was 6% finished with soybean planting. Nebraska and Louisiana were the only two states ahead of their 5-year averages for soybean planting progress. Many winter wheat growing areas would benefit from precipitation. To state the obvious, Kansas plants about 3.5 million more winter wheat acres than the next closest state, and all of Kansas is in some form of drought. The next two states in winter wheat plantings are Texas and Oklahoma. More than 90% of both are also in drought. If wheat in those areas doesn't make it, there's a chance the land could be used to grow another crop. Frayne joined us Thursday morning to discuss the outlook for wheat prices, the May crop report, and the early results from the Wheat Quality Council's Winter Wheat Tour.
Yeah, we're partway through the winter wheat crop tour, and the first couple days of the tour are showing some heavier losses than I think most of the people in the trade were expecting. On the first day, we looked at about a 20% decrease in expected yields from where we were last year. On the second day, which covered mainly the central and southwest portion of Kansas, we're looking at almost a 17% reduction from last year. So as we wrap up the third day, we're going to have to wait to see what the final numbers are, but basically the tour is confirming that the potential drought damage as well as some of the winter kill that we've had is starting to show up and definitely impacting yields.
If there is abandonment in some of those fields, what could that ground go to?
Well, you know, it really depends upon where you are within the region. The majority of the problem we're seeing is because of drought and drought impacts. And as a result, you know, the first issue is, are you going to try and abandon it, try and collect some crop insurance? In most cases, yields are not that bad, so they're going to have to be harvested. And even if they are abandoned because of drought, the obvious question is there enough soil moisture there to actually come back and replant a second crop? And in most cases, I suspect that that's not going to be the case, and so the acres that are abandoned are going to be abandoned.
North Dakota is one of the states in the midst of its spring wheat planting. Update me on the progress of that crop.
Well, this week in particular has been very cold and wet and rainy. We had a very cold winter this year, a lot of frost within the ground. It's taken quite a while for the ground to warm up. The rain that we've had will help with soil temperatures, will help improve that, but it's really delayed our spring planting. It's not to a point where people are getting critical. We're in a really bad place, although a lot of farmers are getting a bit concerned and very frustrated, obviously, with the weather conditions. Extended forecast looks a little bit better. Next week looks warmer and drier. And again, with today's equipment and the size of farms, we can get the crop seeded in a really, really quick hurry if the weather cooperates with us. So it's something to be watching, but nobody's pressing the panic button quite yet.
There's still uncertainty and ongoing turmoil in Ukraine. How is that situation affecting wheat prices here?
Well, there's kind of two different levels of information that we're watching for. There's kind of the short-term issues. The first thing the market's been looking for is, are the export sales that have already been booked, are they being delivered on? And so far, both out of Russia and Ukraine, the exports that have been on the books are being fulfilled. The next thing we're looking for, are there additional sales that are coming from that region? The sales pace seems to be dropping off. Again, some concerns about whether, even if you book some sales, are you going to get delivery on those? So some of the international buyers may be going to other destinations like the U.S. to try and pick up some of those. Longer term, we're watching kind of two things. The first would be what's going to happen for planted acreage, in particular in Ukraine. There's some concerns about farmers getting financing this spring. It's not necessarily going to impact the wheat market per se, because a lot of their wheat is winter wheat, so it's already been seeded, but it could potentially impact the acres of corn, barley, or something like sunflower that are more spring planted. So we do have to watch that. And again, longer term, what's going to the kind of level of sanctions, what's the level of political unrest that's going to be observed in that region. Forecasting politics is even tougher than forecasting the weather, so we got to be watching that every day and seeing and looking for some updates.
Then I'll ask you to forecast the price. That should be an easy one for wheat here.
Yeah. Well, as we look short term, as we look at the charts right now, we are seeing some resistance, some upward resistance. We've had some really nice rallies the last couple of weeks because of all the conditions that we've been talking about. The question is, psychologically, can we push wheat prices higher than what we're seeing right now and today? And again, it's kind of a 50-50 deal. I think there's about 50% odds that we may push it higher, 50% odds that we may see a temporary top, and we may see some retracement as we move forward. So from a marketing standpoint, right now, we're in very uncertain times. It's very hard to get a read on what direction we're headed next.
Reuters did a report this week on some shipping problems in Canada. Farmers having trouble getting rid of last year's harvest to make room for this year's crop. Can you expand on what the transportation issues look like in Canada and in your state as well?
Yeah, and there's been a whole host of issues, kind of a complicated story. The moral is, on the Canadian side of the line, they had an extremely large crop. In fact, the spring wheat crop was about 1.5 times their normal. They've also, just like here in North Dakota, had a very cold, tough winter. Rail transportation has been slowed because of the cold weather and some of the issues there. And they're just trying to handle a lot more volume of bushels, both spring wheat as well as canola. And so there's been some massive delays. There's been some real backlogs in delivery. And there's just, as you look at the math and look at the amount of grain that yet has to be delivered, there's no way that the Canadians are going to be able to deliver all of the crop that they produced last year and be able to get the bins cleaned out by the time we reach 2014 harvest. So kind of the issue that the Canadians are facing right now is, how do we balance old crop inventories and new crop production? And it's going to be a challenge. And some of that is actually spilling over into North Dakota. We have some very similar transportation problems here. We're trying our best to make those adjustments, but it's going to be a challenge.
The May crop report is next Friday. Frayne, expectations going into it?
Yeah, May crop report is the first time that we're going to get USDA forecast for the 2014-15 year, the official forecast out of WASDE. I think there'll be some really interesting things coming out when it looks in particular for the soybean side of the balance sheet. What are the export sales expectations, both for old crop and new crop? And the market will obviously be watching those very, very closely to get a read on what the demand base is.
Next week, University of Missouri Extension economist Ron Plain will join us to analyze hog markets. Again, the May crop report is scheduled for release Friday, May 9th at 11 a.m. Central Time. The U.S. Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center is celebrating its 50th year. In its May cover story, Nebraska Farmer magazine lists the many accomplishments of the 40-plus scientists at U.S. Mark. U.S. Mark is best known internationally for its genetics research, especially in cattle. The center's meat quality and safety research has had a huge impact on beef producers, processors, and consumers. You can learn more about its impact and ongoing research projects in May's Nebraska Farmer. UNL Extension cropping system specialist Greg Kruger says Palmer amaranth has been one of the most challenging glyphosate-resistant weeds so far in the U.S. Kruger says the problem has moved into northern states over the last year or two, with resistance in Nebraska measured as high as 8 to 12 times the field use rate. Unlike kochia, which we discussed a few weeks ago, Kruger says Palmer amaranth will have to be controlled almost throughout the growing season.
The kochia presents a lot of challenges for us in terms of management because it germinates early in spring. A lot of times before we have a chance to get spring residual herbicides down. The Palmer amaranth, unlike that kochia that germinates really early in spring, is really going to come back and it's going to have a wide emergence window. So Palmer amaranth is going to be quite different. We've got to make sure that we continue to stay on top of that one throughout the growing season. We'll see this one germinate as late as August and maybe even early September in some cases. So instead of talking about a weed that we have germinating really early in spring and we've got to get out there early to get it, this one we're really going to have to try to stay on top of throughout the growing season.
Kruger says management of glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranth will be like most other resistant weeds. He advises multiple modes of action, tank mixing when possible, and diversifying cropping systems. There is a website that could help you develop a weed management plan for your operation. It's called takeactiononweeds.com and was built with help from the United Soybean Board. Take Action allows you to identify the sites of action of herbicides, design a strategy to manage weeds, and learn more about resistance issues. The Checkoff sponsored site also features classification and resistance charts. More information can be found online at takeactiononweeds.com. Retail beef prices hit a new high in March, averaging $5.72 per pound. The cost was 15 cents per pound higher than February and nearly 9% more expensive than March 2013. UNL Extension economists Kate Brooks and Matt Stockton recently released a Cornhusker Economics article analyzing the relationship between beef prices and beef demand. We talked with Kate Thursday about how an extremely tight supply of cattle has fueled the cost for the consumer.
They're record levels. We hit record levels last year, and we've continued to see those record levels here in 2014 for the retail beef prices.
What about demand? And you're looking at demand in two different categories, foreign and domestic. First, for foreign, what is foreign beef demand? You
know, we've seen strength in the foreign beef side. In 2013, we were hitting higher levels. We're back to pre-BSE levels. We saw strength in the beginning of 2013 when Japan further opened up their borders, and continued to see that strength through 13. We've continued to see strength here at the beginning of 2014 for foreign beef demand.
What about domestic demand?
Domestic demand has also continued to be strong throughout 2013, as well as we entered here into 2014. Still continuing to see strength within domestic beef demand. And
we'll talk about why that could be a surprise to some, but first let's look at the supply of the meat and the size of the cow herd.
Right, so we've seen record retail prices. A lot of that is being driven currently by the decline in supply. We've hit a 63-year low inventory numbers for beef cow inventory. That relates to a reduction in supply in the retail case.
Okay, so you're looking at the sort of how this all comes together, and you're looking at shifts in demand, or changes in demand, right? Changes in demand. What does change in demand mean?
So changes in demand is where we actually change our demand preferences or don't want to buy that beef anymore. Just because supply has gone down, prices have gone up, but that doesn't necessarily mean you don't demand beef products anymore. You may still demand them, you just may not be able to afford them.
Which would be good news for the beef industry, correct?
Correct.
And counter to what some people might be thinking about, low supply, higher prices, people don't want it anymore.
Right, so just because supply has declined, we've shifted supply down, prices have gone up. So that's one of the big factors as to why prices have gone up. But it doesn't necessarily mean they've declined demand. Their quantity demanded may have changed just because they may not be able to afford it anymore, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're not demanding the product.
What would cause a change in demand?
So things like changes in preferences, so diets. You may not buy beef anymore because your diet changed. Competing meats, so if we see an increase in the production of chicken and pork, that might change your mind to start switching to those competing meats, as well as income levels, the economy growing. Those kind of things can change our demand preferences.
The setup for 2014 is kind of the same as it has been. Questions about the economy. It is dry across the country. what do you look at here to maybe characterize what could happen as we go throughout the year?
So it's real easy to talk about supply and demand and one thing happening, so this is what happens. But in 2014, a lot of things are going to be changing. We're still in a drought in some areas. We're still looking at maybe expanding the cow herd. If we do expand the cow herd, that further reduces supply. But on the demand side, we're looking at, will the economy continue to improve? Will we start to continue to see declines in unemployment, which again would allow more people to be able to afford beef? How are exchange rates going? That would be for not domestic, excuse me, foreign demand. Yeah. If the exchange rates are still favorable, that can help lend to foreign demand continuing to be strong.
The full Cornhusker Economics article on retail beef prices and demand is available online and can be found through the Market Journal website. Widespread rain during the last week forced farmers in parts of the state out of the field, but it also provided needed moisture to Nebraska's ranges and pastures. With calving wrapping up, many producers are likely starting to look at putting their animals on grasses. UNL Extension educator Berger joined us this week from Kimball to discuss spring turnout and whether a delayed release might benefit farmers and ranchers in some areas of the state.
Yeah, I think pasture conditions are kind of variable depending on how they were managed through the drought. We had some excellent moisture last fall. If you remember the storm system that caused some of the flooding, especially on the South Platte River, a lot of that moisture moved its way up into at least the western third of the panhandle. And so we went into the winter with a good soil moisture profile. A lot of that soil moisture is still there. And so some of the cool season grasses are starting to get up and going. The last 2 months, in terms of the South Panhandle anyway, we haven't received very much in terms of significant precip. So the top is drying out, and I think that's starting to delay some of this cool season grass from growing.
Is this a year where some producers might want to think about delaying turning out their cows into those pastures?
Yeah, I think it sure is. And depending on the grass resources you have, depending on the condition of that rangeland, if we can delay turnout, what we really do is give that plant a greater opportunity to grow more leaf material. We allow it to root a little deeper, use some of that moisture that's further down in the profile. And then it also allows us to really more effectively capture and keep some of these thunderstorm rains that might come more quickly. At least in the western part of the state, we had a very open winter, good opportunity to graze out, use a lot of crop residue, and so there's probably more carryover hay than sometimes we might expect to have. And so I think this is a year where we might actually think about feeding a little longer in some cases, delaying turnout on that rangeland, giving those cool season grasses a little time to recover again from the drought stress and get some more leaf material up, hopefully capture some rain here in the next 30 days.
Should there be a change in stocking rate? And I guess you could look at that both ways. If you are going to delay turnout and have the extra feed and forage, and if you don't have it and you need to turn out right away.
I think from a delay and stocking rate standpoint, I think you probably want to assess range condition. If you really feel like your range has gone backwards because of the drought and you need to reduce your total stocking, then I think that's something you can look at. If we're looking at a 5-month grazing season and we delay turnout by, say, 2 or 3 weeks, we've already reduced the total amount of forage we're going to be harvesting over that period of time if we move, say, from a traditional 5-month grazing season down to maybe close to 4. So I think looking at the length of time the cattle are going to be grazing, looking at the range condition and where it's at and just available soil moisture you have. The other really critical thing in my mind is the month of May is really critical, at least in the western part of the state for us in terms of grass growth. And so moisture over the next 30 days is really going to set the table, so to speak, on our grass growth for these cool season grasses.
When the cattle do get out there, how do you make the most of the winter annuals that are still left in the pasture and still offer something of nutrition?
Yeah, I think the cool conditions we had in the fall with that ample available moisture, a lot of our winter annuals that are invaders like cheatgrass sure have been coming on aggressively this spring. And so this is almost going to sound contradictory when I say I think some pastures could benefit from delayed turnout, but if you have a situation where you have a lot of cheatgrass there, it's kind of a use it or lose it type situation. And so I think what's ideal in some cases, if you can go ahead, get cattle out, use that cheatgrass while it still is palatable to them, and then maybe actually look at taking them to a different pasture or even bringing them back and feeding them hay for a while to allow those other later developing native cool season grasses to go ahead and come back and compete is really a situation that probably could be beneficial in some situations.
We know cow-calf producers will get a good price for the calf that they're going to sell if they're going to sell it, but what kind of input prices are they facing right now?
You know, our input costs, as I look at our cost of production, are really kind of sobering when we look what's happened over the last 5 years. We continue to have a shortage of grass in Nebraska, and prices on a per pair basis, on a rental rate per pair per month, or on a stocker yearling or replacement heifer, really continue to increase rapidly. There's a long list of people looking for grass and a short list of people that have it available. So when you look at our feed cost right now for summer grazing, and you include some winter cost, it's pretty sobering. We can get $600 just in feed costs pretty easily in a cow-calf pair, and that doesn't include really many extras from a feed standpoint.
You look at the UNL drought monitor and you see, Aaron, that 90% of Nebraska is still in some form of drought. At some point, does drought become a threat to restocking the cow herd?
You know, I think it's certainly going to make people think about what they do. You know, as we look at the cow herd numbers, though, and we look at the prices of these calves, there's a lot of incentive right now to get heifers bred and to begin to start rebuilding the cow herd. So I think people are going to be pretty aggressive still at this point about continuing to retain replacement heifers. Even with high-priced feed, from a forage standpoint, some of these grain prices and harvested feeds have come down certainly from where they were in 2012 and 2013. And so I think dry lotting some of these animals still is probably a favorable option right now with current feed prices, with the value of them as a bred female on today's market.
The latest U.S. drought monitor from UNL shows 93% of Nebraska is now in drought. That's the largest percentage since October 15th, 2013. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we begin for the weekly forecast. Of course, the big news during this last week was the upper air low pressure system that moved into our region during the early part of the week and then just basically petered itself out as it swung around the upper Midwest and gave us daily chances of showers and brought in much cooler weather. We did see some significant rainfall across small portions of the state with this system, and we've seen our first widespread severe weather outbreak as we've seen our first surge of 50s to low 60s dew points into the region. And in front of that low, as it brought that Gulf moisture up into our region, it was the focal point for widespread precipitation in eastern Nebraska. In most locations, between a half an inch to an inch and a quarter was common reported. We had some isolated spots with over 2 inches. Unfortunately, as the farther west you got, the closer you got into the drier air mass, and we did not see the significant moisture. To the east of us, almost too much of a good thing. We've had very wet conditions in the eastern Corn Belt. This storm system just added to the misery, and along with the cool temperatures, we wouldn't expect to see anything in the way of significant field activity, particularly from Illinois eastward, until we at least get into the middle of next week at the earliest. And with another system impending as we go into the middle of next week, there may only be an opportunity for a couple days of planting, at least in the eastern Corn Belt. Now for Nebraska, it looks like a very nice stretch of weather, the perfect opportunity to get some planting caught up and possibly even get completed before our next system moves into the Central Plains region as we get into the midweek period. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we might expect as we go forward in time. One thing I'll draw your attention to is we do have this ridge that's starting to build in, and the northwest flow remains across northeast Nebraska in association with the trough that's now over the Great Lakes. So as we go through this afternoon and evening, we would expect some maybe slight cloudiness to build up into northeastern Nebraska with just an outside chance of an isolated thunderstorm. We don't expect anything toward the south and to the west. It should be a very nice day, primarily in the 70s statewide. Now as we go into tomorrow, we'll see that the periphery of the ridge is starting to build into the Central Plains, and it's going to bring much warmer temperatures. We should be looking at temperatures well in the 70s across the entire region, with just an outside chance once again for the development of scattered isolated showers or thunderstorms in the northeastern part of the state, closer to where the jet formation is. With the remainder of us, it looks to be more of a partly cloudy day. Very nice temperatures, easily into the mid-70s statewide, with again some 80s possible across southwest Nebraska. Now as we go into Monday, the ridge starts to shift a little bit to our east. We get a southwesterly flow aloft in the upper atmosphere as another trough starts to move into the Pacific Northwest, and we're going to see a nice bump up of temperatures once again A couple more degrees, we're looking at the upper 70s to possibly even to the low to mid 80s across the southwest under partly cloudy skies. Now as we get into Tuesday, the system starts digging into the southwest and starts shooting moisture up at the lower levels up into western Nebraska. So there is the opportunity for some scattered thunderstorm activity to possibly develop across extreme northwestern Nebraska. And then as we get into Wednesday, the system starts to move out into the region, and we should see the development, at least in the western half of the state, of showers and scattered thunderstorm activity. And there is indications that we could see a severe weather outbreak. And as we get into Thursday, we see that the trough digs deeper and brings another fetch of moisture in. So we're looking at an extended period of thunderstorm activity for central and eastern Nebraska, maybe letting off a little bit in western Nebraska. But once again, we'll have to be on the lookout for severe weather. And as we get into Friday, we'll start to see the system trying to move through the southern plains, keeping the moisture just south of Nebraska, a little bit farther northward, and we'll see another round of significant moisture across the southern half of the state. But overall, we'll see a drying trend, at least temporarily, before yet another system comes down the pipeline late in the weekend to the early part of the following week. Now, as we look at the temperature forecast, very nice conditions. Most of the thunderstorms in the early part of this forecast are very isolated in nature and confined to northeastern Nebraska. More widespread precipitation starts developing as we get into the Wednesday-Thursday time frame, moving from west to east with the possibility of severe weather. And then we'll start to see a slight cool down as we get toward next weekend. Now, as we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast, it looks like the temperatures will remain below normal across most of the Intermountain region and above normal to our southeast. In terms of precipitation, widespread precipitation as another slug of energy starts coming into our region. So this presents the perfect opportunity for planting. We may start to see some significant planting delays develop, especially if the precipitation in the middle of next week turns heavy. Now, in terms of the forecast for the month of May, we're looking at cooler than normal conditions from Nebraska northward. In terms of precipitation, one of the most expected or unexpected forecasts put out by CPC, a large area from the northwest to the southeast, including all of Nebraska, for above normal precipitation.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews on market analysis, glyphosate-resistant Palmer Amaranth, beef demand, and pasture turnout are available individually on the Market Journal website. Each interview can also be found on the Market Journal mobile app, available for free in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Next week, Ron Plain will be our hog marketing analyst. Stephen Wagulo will look at potential problems in Nebraska's winter wheat, and Nebraska Department of Ag Director Greg Ibaugh will discuss numbers from the 2012 Census of Agriculture. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.